So my name is Alex. Just as a way of introduction, I'm 24 years old and I'm doing my PhD in green hydrogen production. So as I said, I'm going to be the speaker for tonight. I'll be about just under half an hour. I'm going to be talking about what drove me to be an activist, what drove me to do this and take 7 months out of my very relevant PhD and looking for an alternative fuel. Because I went to a talk like this in mid-March, and just 2 weeks later, I ran in front of a moving oil tanker on the first day of action. This is me here. And the reason why I did that is because I learned from that talk two main things. The one was sort of the urgency of the climate crisis. You always hear about it, but you never really sunk in for me of how serious the situation was. And the second was how little the governments and other people who should be doing things are actually doing. So the first thing that always comes to mind when we talk about the climate crisis is net zero by 2050. It's constantly covered by newspapers and journalists and the government and society, but can we really wait until 2050? You guys have seen the summer that we've just had and you know that we can't. Because obviously the one thing that is massively increasing as besides just the global temperature is the number of cases of natural disasters. And the more our global temperature escalates, the more and more that's going to happen. And I don't want you to just think of like, oh, 1.5 degrees, 1.2 degrees, whatever. I want you to think about what those natural disasters actually mean. Because what they mean is massive floods, like the ones we saw in Europe last year, tornadoes and hurricanes. It means droughts, like this one in South Africa and Cape Town, where people ran out of water. And it means wildfires, like the ones in Australia, where almost 3 billion animals were killed or hurt. And what's not talked about is the compounding effect that these have. They all occur at the same sort of places around the same kind of times. That happens very frequently. They create this escalation effect. For example, if you have a drought and the land is more dry, there's more likely to be a wildfire. If it's more likely to be a wildfire, all the carbon dioxide in those trees is released. And there's no more trees to capture future carbon dioxide. And it makes the problem worse. So it's more likely to be a drought, it's more likely to be a wildfire, and it escalates. It creates a cascade. But the other thing as well is because you're in a drought, you can't put out the wildfire. You don't have enough water left. That's what's often not talked about. Yeah, sure, we'll get more natural disasters, but also they're going to be worse and they're going to be lasting a lot longer. And we're going to be able to deal with them less and less. I'm going to go through a couple natural disasters that you may or may not have seen because we've been going through so many. I know a lot of you already know how bad the situation is, so I won't go on about it too long because you've seen that train tracks spontaneously combusted in London this year when it was 40 degrees, that the ambulances and the NHS was put on black alert because of this. 1,775 people were estimated to have died over the 2 days of heat wave. It was so hot that it was the busiest day for firefighters since World War II. 60 people lost their homes in wildfires in London. And as I said about the droughts earlier, it got to the stage where in France, they had to put out the wildfires with liquid manure because there was no more water. That's what we're talking about in 2022. I'm not going to talk too much about what's going to happen in the future because in all honesty, what's happening now is by far scary enough and should by far drive us to do action. For example, last month, it was 27 degrees at the North Pole. You would take your jumper off at the North Pole. You can bet that melts a lot of ice. And because of this, because of the heat waves, because of the massive droughts we have, we're experiencing crop failures. 2022, and we're already experiencing crop failures, which could be up to 50% at the end of the year. Almost half the potato crop in this country is at risk. A third of the wheat in this country is at risk. and it's 2022. And it's things like this that you just don't hear about, because we'll for the moment we'll import wheat and we'll import the potatoes from elsewhere, and it's okay for now. But what if it's suddenly not? Then we have a global crisis on a scale that no one's ever seen. I am going to share with you a couple paragraphs from this article that I read last month that really connected with me emotionally. This article, well, I'm just going to read it out loud. My friend has a niece, his sister's daughter. They still live in the Indian subcontinent, a beautiful and learned place. The niece is all of 5 years old, a bright and curious and intelligent little girl, an observant one. One day recently, the niece asked her mother a question she began to ask over and over. Mummy, where's the monster? At first, her mum dismissed the question. Kids would be kids. All kinds of strange and funny and sometimes jarring questions. But the daughter kept asking. She'd frown, scrunch up her little face. There was something in her tiny world that was out of place. She didn't understand something was wrong, unnatural, and she needed her mummy, her rock, her guiding light to give her an explanation. So she, and the determined way little kids of a certain kind can be, wouldn't take silence or refusal or dismissal or denial for an answer. Again and again, Mummy, where's the monster? This went on for a whole week. And finally, wondering something was really wrong with her daughter, her mother, my friend's sister, asked in a combination of exasperation and concern, Darling, there is no monster. Monsters aren't real, you know that. Everything's fine. What makes you think there's a monster? What monster? The monster that's killing all the birds, Mummy. You see, this is from the time of the Pakistan heat wave, where temperatures were frequently above 40 degrees. It was so hot that birds were falling out of the sky from dehydration. I can't imagine any image more apocalyptic than birds that have fallen from the sky and litter the pavement. If you've ever seen an apocalypse movie, like before the meteor hits or something, the birds always fly away, and that's always like the first sign that something's about to go down. We're at the stage now where the birds can't even fly away. This didn't just happen in Pakistan, this happened in London too, during our heat wave. And in Spain as well, except in Spain, it was so hot that the baby birds were being cooked alive in the nest. This is the stage we're at now. And that heat wave, the one in India and Pakistan, that's just the beginning. It's predicted that in 8 years' time, 92% of countries will experience a similar one in a century heat wave every second year. Every second year. How are we going to grow crops on land like that? How are we going to have water? How are we going to survive? A few months later, in the same place in Pakistan, just a couple of weeks ago, you all know it, 33 million people were affected by the recent floods in Pakistan. I'm from Scotland. This is over 6 times the population of my entire country were affected and displaced by the floods in Pakistan, just a few months after the terrible heat waves that they had. Over 16 million of those people that were displaced were children. And this was caused exactly because of those heat waves. The heat wave caused the glacier and the mountains to melt, and that caused heavier than normal monsoon rains. We are reaching tipping points. You hear about them often, and I could go on and on about how dangerous tipping points are, but I'm just going to give you 3 that I think are the most important. The first one is the energy that's required to melt ice is astronomical. It's about 10,000 lightning bolts worth of energy every single second. And when there's less ice, that energy heats the land instead. And that makes the problem so much worse. Second one, there's a lot of trapped methane in glacial ice and permafrost. About, I don't even know how much, but when that methane is released on a short-term basis, it's 86 times more polluting than carbon dioxide. That again creates another tipping point, puts more emissions in the air, traps the heat. But the last one, and one that I think is the most important and not talked about, is what happens when rainforests lose their rainforest conditions. You see, rainforest, they generate their own rain, they generate their own sustainable conditions which they live in. When it gets to the point where they can no longer do that, the entire rainforest dies in a matter of years. The Amazon rainforest, which is twice the size of all of India, could experience this within the next few years. It's predicted that when it gets to 20% deforestation in the Amazon, the entire rainforest will no longer sustain its conditions. We're on 17% deforestation already. All of those trees, all the carbon dioxide trapped there, released in one go. It's hard to come back from that. So how can we combat this? It's such a good question, but it's a question you all know the answer to. We have really good solar energy, wind energy, wave energy, hydrogen-powered trains, buses, ships, planes, even tidal energy. We live on an island. Why the hell are we not using tidal energy? We can get almost a tenth of our entire energy just from tidal alone. Renewable energy is truly amazing. And everyone's going to say like, oh, but it's too expensive or whatever. No, it's not. It's been cheaper for the last 2 years. And it's recently been found that renewable energies are now 9 times cheaper than UK gas. And the new renewable energy that it was talking about was offshore wind. And onshore wind and solar power are both cheaper than offshore wind. So it's over 9 times cheaper than gas. If your energy bill is £900 or £100, that's going to make a difference, isn't it? And the reason why I bring up energy bills is because it's predicted that 2/3 of UK families could be in fuel poverty by January. Just about 4 months away, maybe not even. 2/3 of families could be in fuel poverty. And the reason why I'm going to talk about fuel poverty in this talk, I'm going to explain just now. And I'm going to first go back to that little girl in Pakistan. You see, she couldn't imagine that there was something that could just bring birds out of the sky like that there wasn't like some sort of monster, some sort of figure that was doing that. But we all know there wasn't a monster. Except, what if there was? What if the monster is the companies that are trying to make over 40 new fossil fuel facilities over the next few years, despite knowing what's happening elsewhere in the world? Just those 40 new ones. Forget everything else. Forget all the cars in the UK. Forget everything else. Just those 40 new ones are going to triple our yearly greenhouse gas emissions. And if 40 wasn't bad enough, Liz Truss says she wants to approve 130 new oil facilities. 130. Where is the monster? Perhaps the monster is the government who is subsidizing this industry, the most profitable industry in the entire world, with £236 million a week. It's the cost of living crisis where almost 2/3 of people could be choosing between heating and eating. And yet this industry, which the head of BP has literally said he has more cash than he knows what to do with, is being subsidized with £236 million every single week. The oil sector has received $3 billion a day in pure profit for the last 50 years. You bet that holds a lot of power. Liz Truss used to work at Shell. Her government has received about, I can't remember the exact number. I should have put it in the slides. I think it's 1.5 million in donations from oil and gas companies. I'll look it up afterwards. But that makes a huge difference. And that's why we're not making more progress. Because we don't need fossil fuels. It's as simple as that. We have 8 years of oil in reserve, which is more than enough time for a fair transition to renewable energies and to make sure that the oil workers are reskilled and treated fairly. You're probably wondering, well, 8 years is not that long. Well, the biggest UK solar panel farm was built in 6 weeks. 6 weeks. And if I can bring you back to this headline of trying to bring 130 new fossil fuel facilities, it says here, the Climate Change Committee has previously said it takes an average of 28 years for an exploration license to lead to oil and gas production. That takes us exactly to 2050. Net zero by 2050 is the biggest lie imaginable. We could be trying to fix the Ukraine crisis in a matter of 6 weeks if we really cared about it. That's a fossil-fueled war. And yet we're still going, oh, we need our own North Sea oil and gas. It's such bull. Where is the monster? Maybe the monster is the fossil fuel companies that are trying to create these new facilities and spend $103 million a day for the rest of the decade exploiting new fields of oil and gas. I want to point you to this, unconventional and higher risk. So many of their projects are unconventional and higher risk. There's nothing unconventional about solar energy. There's no reason not to do it. And yet there was almost no mention of oil and gas in the COP26 final deal. We are going to die waiting for politicians to make the right decisions. The reason why there was no mention of oil and gas in COP26 is because there was 503 oil lobbyists at COP26, which outnumbers indigenous populations by a factor of 2 to 1. There are so many solutions. And I've talked about renewable energy because that's what I know most about for my PhD, but we could be doing insulation, saving people almost half on their energy bills and cutting their carbon emissions for the heating of the house almost in half too. We could be subsidizing public transport. According to the World Bank, we can get a total profit of almost $20 trillion by the end of the decade with good investment. We can get almost 12 million decent green jobs just from subsidizing public transport. There's no reason not to do that. The government, they created, they asked the International Energy Agency for a report about fossil fuels. The report for that about fossil fuels came back saying this: no new oil, gas, or coal development if the world is to reach net zero by 2050. That was released last year, and still here we are. This is one of my favorite. No, sorry, I've jumped ahead of the gun. Even I can't even begin to express this next part. Even the High Court is deeming the government unlawful on its own climate change policies. And yet nobody's holding them to account. They're only holding us to account. Nobody is talking about that literally the government are breaking the law in this way. This is why this is one of my favorite quotes. Climate activists are sometimes dangerous radicals, but the truly dangerous radicals are the countries that are increasing the production of fossil fuels. Investing in new fossil fuel infrastructure is moral and economic madness. That was actually said by the current UN Secretary General. The head of the UN is calling our government mad for investing in new fossil fuels. Look, we cannot delay. What we do over the next 3 to 4 years is going to determine the future of humanity. Such a powerful quote, and that was said by the former chief scientific advisor to the UK government, Sir David King. He said that last year. We have 2 to 3 years left to determine the future of humanity. But there is hope, and that's what I want to get across in this next part. 2 to 3 years to make change seems crazy, doesn't it? But when we act like we are in an emergency, so many amazing things can happen. For example, during COVID, it was horrible. We went into lockdown, nobody enjoyed that. But yet we did it because it was necessary and lives were saved because of that. I talked about when Cape Town in South Africa almost ran out of water. Yet, what they did was over the course of 3 weeks, they nearly halved their water usage and they completely changed their irrigation system. And they survived. But yet they got lucky because it rained really heavily later in the year. If it wasn't for that, What I'm saying is that we shouldn't have to wait until we're in a near unavoidable emergency to act like we're in an emergency. Because although it may not be, I mean, it is really serious for us now. I've shown you about the crops and about everything else. It affects others more than it affects us. And that's why we have a moral obligation to do whatever we can to help those people. Because the global north, such as like the United States, European Union, they're responsible for 92% of excess emissions. Whereas the global south suffers more than 90% of the costs of climate breakdown and has 98% of the deaths associated with it. What we do affects others. And when they try and protest, when they try and speak up, they risk getting shot. This is the picture of a South African woman who was trying to block I think it was a coal mine, shot dead in her own home. If all I have to do to try and stop global starvation within a decade is to sit in front of an oil tanker and wait to get arrested, then I'm going to do that. And so should you. Because this is not a one-time occurrence. 227 climate activists were murdered in the year 2020. We need to do everything we can to make sure that those people don't have to go through that, don't have to go through the horrible floods of Pakistan, go through the horrible floods of Puerto Rico. There are so many examples I can give about the power of social activism. This is how we got the vote. This is how we got the right to roam. This is how we got a 2-day weekend. This is how we got health and safety laws. This is how we have pretty much every form of radical change. But the one I want to focus on is the freedom riders. The freedom riders, these people on the screen, were 13 people, 7 black, who were trying to fight racism in the UK. It was 1961. The Montgomery bus boycotts had just happened. And yet, although that was a huge success, there was no momentum afterwards. So these people decided, enough is enough. We can't go on like this. So they wrote their wills and they sat on a segregated bus and they rode it through Virginia, which was a really racist state, into Alabama, which was an extremely racist state. They trained in nonviolence beforehand, but they weren't quite sure how violent things were going to get against them. The doors were locked and their bus was set on fire. They only made it out with their lives because the smoke from the fire pushed the doors open. And yet, when they got out, when they got desperately beat up, when ambulances refused to take them, and they had to rely on the will of Good Samaritans to get them to the hospital. When all of that happened, and they saw how hated they were, each one of them still said, I'm going back on the road as soon as I am able. Because that's what it takes to make history. This could have been a horrible story of 13 people getting massively beat up, but it became one of the greatest successes in the civil rights movements. It spawned 1,000 other campaigns and ultimately led to the civil rights movement that we know. It wasn't just those 13 people doing that, because not a month later, not a week later, just 3 days later, after seeing these pictures, 10 other people got inspired and they did the exact same thing. They too got really, really badly beat up and hurt. They too got imprisoned for doing this, for sitting on a segregated bus. Yeah, it kept going. That second wave inspired a third. That third wave inspired a fourth. It got to the point where 328 people were put in one of the worst prisons in the US. And at that point, the government, they knew this was going to keep happening. So they cracked. That's what won. It was the pure dedication That's what we need from everybody, is the inspiration that these people had to inspire further movements. And you see, as I mentioned, it wasn't popular. They were hated at the time. 60% of people said it was going to massively hurt the civil rights movement, and 20% were unopinionated. But it worked. Same goes for one of the most beloved figures right now, Martin Luther King. In 2011, 94% were completely favorable of Martin Luther King. Yet back in the day, in 1966, it was only 33%, and 63% was completely unfavorable towards Martin Luther King. He was the most hated man in America at the time, and yet now we love him. And I'm not trying to compare this next group to the civil rights movement, because I know how controversial they are, but I want to show their effectiveness as well. I'm going to talk very briefly about Insulate Britain and the amazing success which they had from just a very small campaign. Because ultimately they were about 100 people or so, very small, and 62% of the public said those protests was going to make people less supportive about the cause of insulation and about climate change. After that, just 2 months after that, Labour added insulation to their manifesto, and 84% of people, when asked, said that insulation was very important to curb reliance on Russian gas. Just a couple of months ago, we got this paper from the Sunday Times, of all papers, saying Insulate Britain weren't mad after all, they were right. They may be really unpopular, but they did a lot of great things. Nobody was talking about insulation before. Now everyone is. And considering our energy bills, we should be talking about it even more. When Just Stop Oil had their first 2 actions in April, they were just about 450 people, and yet we blocked 45%, or maybe it was 53% of all oil in the southeast of England. After that, there was an independent YouGov poll which said the number of people who said they would consider engaging in climate change protests went up fairly significantly. People know now how bad the situation is, that they're still willing to come and support us. Back then we had, like, as I say, 450 people. Now we're already in the thousands. I think it's truly amazing what a small group of people can do. 400 people blocked 50% of all oil in the southeast of England, or whatever it was. We have 40 people on this call. If we do the maths, that means you could stop, 5% of all oil in the southeast of England, just us. How amazing is that? One of the reasons why I think Just Stop Oil is so effective is because of our demands. The head of the International Energy Agency, the UN Secretary General, everybody is saying how great these demands are, not specifically in relation to Just Stop Oil, but just they're so no-brainer. These demands are no new oil. As I say, we had 8 years in reserve. It's more than enough time. Tax the big polluters and billionaires. I've shown you how much money they make and how we can pretty much solve the cost of living crisis just by that one demand alone. Energy for all, having a basic level of energy for everybody. Insulating homes, cheap public transport makes so much sense. We shouldn't have to be doing crazy actions like this in order to make it happen. One thing I want to leave you with is the power of actions. This is a police cell. What we're asking for is people to take action to the point of arrest. And I know it's a very scary thing, and not everybody can do so. I'm a straight white male, and thankfully I've always had quite good experiences, but it varies so much for different people. And I cannot say for certain one way or another how things will go. But what we're asking for is just for one time at the very least, if you're able to take action to the point of arrest. It involves putting yourself in a difficult situation and spending a night in a cell like this. The cell is generally not too bad. The most daunting feeling is that you have no sense of time. and that you have to ask the police officer for everything, be it tea, food, water, blankets. But the food's not as bad as you'd expect. It's usually microwavable vegan lasagnas. But as I say, not everybody can get arrested. So that's why there's so many other ways that you can help. We'd love it if you could take action with us. And again, all of these roles we're going to cover a bit more in the breakout groups. But the next big action is on October 1st, where we're all going to occupy Westminster. It's a non-arrestable action, and there are going to be thousands of people there, and we need as many people there as possible in order to make our voices heard. It's going to be historic. I cannot wait. It's going to be amazing. So if you cannot come down for October 1st or October 2nd, which you really should if you can, then please consider doing a support role with us, such as helping us with the admin side, doing ringing, calling up people who are interested in talks before, doing police station support. So when somebody comes out of a cell, you get them tea and a big hug. It's such a lovely feeling. Help us get more people along to talks like this, such as with leafleting and door knocking. Or if you can't do any of those things, please donate. We're fighting a multi-billion-pound industry with just a few thousand people. And we want to keep going for as long as possible. So what we're asking for is if you're able to give what you'd make in an hour difference. I want to leave you with this quote, which I really like. The future isn't cast into one inevitable course. On the contrary, we could cause the sixth great mass extinction in Earth's history, or we could create a prosperous civilization, sustainable over the long haul. Either is possible, starting from now. You see, we're not just fighting to lower emissions, because in order to face the climate crisis, we have to overcome racism, income inequality, all of these systemic issues. We're fighting for, insulation, public transport, all good things. We're fighting for a better world. And if that's not worth putting your money, putting your time, putting your body on the line for, I don't know what is. This is the most important moment in human history. Do you think about it? Because we're facing an extinction like we've never faced before. Don't be a bystander to this historic moment. Don't live to regret it. Imagine you're on a bus. It's 1955, and there's a Black woman sitting in front of you. Let's call her Rosa Parks, for example. And she's being told to leave the bus. Are you going to sit down and be one of those people that said nothing, as history has shown? Or are you going to stand up and are you going to make your voice heard? Because that's what we need. Few people can make an enormous amount of difference. So I really hope to see you all on October 1st.